The news world is too filled with hot takes and conjecture. Reporters rush to say anything they can about whatever just happened before facts are in. This show is different. It's thought through and researched. And that's a promise that I make to you. This show will be about taking a deep breath and focusing on crucial issues in the media world in order to get the media to do a better job by all of us. All this clamoring for your attention before there's new concrete information to share with you is ultimately damaging and a waste of your time. We can, of course, see that when any big news event happens, and the latest example is the shooting at a Trump event. To be fair, it will take time to see how well or how badly the media is doing in the initial reporting. That initial reporting is still happening right now. I can tell you some things that I'll be looking out for. For starters, inaccuracies. There are basically always big inaccuracies after any kind of an attack. I'll look to see whether the media adequately owns that and does something about it to try to reach people who heard something false. Also, hypocrisy. There should be zero interviews in which Republicans accuse Democrats of creating an environment for political violence without journalists pushing back and saying, wait a second, you're the party of January 6th, AR-15s being widely available, constant talk of traitors deserving the death penalty. The Charlottesville Nazis praised Trump, and Trump has encouraged some types of violence. Also, does anyone even remember when he said Second Amendment people could help stop Hillary Clinton? What kind of environment did that contribute to? Journalists have an obligation to point this stuff out every time. They should also keep a close eye on which Democrats they're listening to. A handful of Democrats refused to vote for a resolution condemning Hamas after the October 7th attacks and supporting Israel's right to defend itself. That resolution did not mean agreeing with every action the Israeli military takes. One Democrat, Rashida Tlaib, didn't even vote for a resolution condemning Hamas's use of sexual violence. She should absolutely be questioned about whether, in general, she has clearly stood against violence. Political violence operates against democracy. And we need the media to stand staunchly for democracy. That is my focus today. And this is actually something I was already working on and researching for you. I was interviewed on a conservative radio show by host Martha Zoller. She said how much she was enjoying this podcast, which I appreciate. And she was wondering why, after having started with bias in media coverage of Israel, I then also moved on to media coverage of other things, including politics.
Why did you choose to take a little diversion from what you have been talking about to address the presidential debate?
I explained what I talked about early in this show, that I've always planned on tackling lots of problems with the media's failure to ensure that it's providing truth always. The October 7th massacres by Hamas showed the urgency of tackling anti-Israel bias in the news. So I started there. As I've thought about it, I also realized that I should point something out here on this show. Lies in the media that fuel anti-Israel bias and political lies might seem like different things, but they're actually largely the same. Not just because of how they show failures in the news media. They speak to democracy. If you believe that the people should be allowed to choose their leaders and hold leaders accountable, then you want the people to have the truth in making those choices. And if you believe in democracy, then you want to stand against all threats to it, whether those threats align themselves with the political right or the political left. Sadly, so many news organizations these days are only paying attention to the threat to democracy from one side while downplaying the threat on the other side. And that failure is having a massive effect. In looking into this, I discovered something. The effect that the media is having on anti-democratic forces here in the United States is different from what it is in Europe. The news media here are creating particular dangers and fueling anti-democratic efforts in specific ways. I'll explain that ahead. Plus, the media's role in the quick downfall of efforts to bring democracy to some other countries in recent years. You're going to hear from someone trying desperately to help democracy take off in her country. And she says, media, please, we need you to make this happen. And while the fight for people's rights is for every generation, There's something different happening now that has never happened before, and it's all about the role of the media. That and more coming up today on They Stand Corrected. Hello, welcome. Josh Lebs here. This is my podcast, They Stand Corrected. I spent 20 years inside mainstream media, 10 years on NPR, 10 years at CNN. I was a fact checker on air and online. And in that process, I also saw how way too much of what gets said and published was not adequately fact-checked or was missing context. We need two things to ensure the truth: facts plus context. If you're new to the show, thanks for joining us. I always encourage people to go back and listen to earlier episodes. Sometimes I refer back to them, and you can always find all of them wherever you're listening to shows or at my website, joshlebs.com. Also, I have a newsletter that comes out with each episode that's packed with links. Actually, I generally send out more than one newsletter for each episode these days. And if you subscribe, then you can see all of them. We are getting support for the show. Some people are becoming paid subscribers. We're hearing from sponsors. All this is fantastic. The more we get support from people like you, the more we can help this grow and start pushing the news to do a much, much, much better job of putting the truth first, always. I hear from listeners all the time, especially through the newsletter, and often that is what inspires the topics, including today: democracy under threat. Let's start with this. Is it the media's role to stand for democracy? You might think, well, why should the news media stand for anything? They should just tell us what's going on. But the first question in all journalism is inevitably subjective. Before you look into what the facts and the context are, you have a choice to make. What stories to cover? Which voices to hear from? What's important? That is all about values. In America, most mainstream news organizations do make clear that they value democracy. Here's NBC.
How do you think this moment is testing our democracy?
NPR.
By some measures, democracy has been in decline around the globe for more than a decade. Today, we offer a glimmer of hope from across the pond, where former Prime Minister Boris Johnson tried to chip away at Britain's checks and balances.
Why is it a glimmer of hope? Well, because democracy is important. Sometimes local news makes this clear. Here's KNTV.
The beauty of our democracy is these elections are free, they're fair, they're open, and they're very transparent.
And the Washington Post's motto, adopted in 2017, is "Democracy dies in darkness." The news media make clear that they support democracy. Meanwhile, democracy is under threat, both here at home and around the world. President Biden was right when he said this about Russia under Vladimir Putin attacking Ukraine and Hamas, a proxy of Iran, attacking Israel.
Hamas and Putin represent different threats, but they share this in common. They both want to completely annihilate a neighboring democracy, completely annihilate it.
Mainstream news organizations have had no trouble pointing out that Russia's attack on Ukraine is an act against democracy. Here's CNN pointing out something that Trump said in an interview.
So former President Trump thinks that Vladimir Putin's aggression against Ukraine's democracy is wonderful, is genius, is smart.
But if you're following the mainstream media's coverage about Israel fighting back against Hamas, how often have you seen the journalists even mention that Hamas and Iran are fighting against democracy? They might have guests on the air who say it, but the news agencies themselves incredibly rarely. When I went digging through clips, it was depressing. I decided to share this one with you, and you'll hear why. It's so telling. It was like, how do they not realize what they're doing? This was from PBS. They had a guest on who was talking about democracy in India. All right, so here's the tail end of that interview.
That is not what we imagine for functioning democracy.
Irfan Nuruddin of Georgetown University, thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Then music came on, and they transitioned into this next segment.
The Israel-Hamas war is inflicting a devastating toll on civilians. Tens of thousands of Palestinians and more than 1,000 Israelis have been killed since October. Among them are journalists.
Okay, so that segment that they went into, no mention from the journalists themselves that Israel is the only democracy in MENA, MENA, Middle East, North Africa. But it gets worse. The so-called journalists that they were referring to, no mention that many of them are actually propagandists for Hamas. The organization they were talking to about this counts all these people who are part of Hamas propaganda efforts as quote-unquote journalists. In reality, according to one report, a third of the so-called journalists killed in Gaza have been affiliated with terrorist groups. Plus, the PBS report included these complaints about Israel's actions toward Al Jazeera, with no mention that Al Jazeera is a state-owned propaganda outlet of the authoritarian nation Qatar. I did a whole episode about that. If there is any time that reporters should be especially likely to emphasize the fact that Israel stands alone as a democracy, it should be when they are talking about news reporting, because they know that democratic freedoms are essential for reporting. But they're not just ignoring that Israel is a democracy, they're actually inverting the whole situation. In the past, I've played for you some clips from CNN's Christiane Amanpour talking with Jon Stewart on The Daily Show. In that interview, she praised Al Jazeera. Again, no mention of what it really is, or the fact that it lies about so incredibly many things. In that conversation, she also said this about Israel.
They, on their television, are not seeing the full horror of the civilian casualties in Gaza. It's just not.
Unreal. Complaints that Israel is the side not seeing reality in this war? Israel is a democracy. You can say whatever you want. No mention in there of the skewed, biased, quote-unquote news that people get in Gaza or in all Arab and Muslim nations, all of which are non-democratic. And by the way, when I was at CNN, we were always making decisions about what to show and not show in terms of the horrors of war. War is hell. No news agency in the world shows the full horror. And Christiane knows that. Meanwhile, propaganda outlets in anti-democratic Arab and Muslim nations are pushing lies. She, of course, did not mention any of that, so you wouldn't even know. And Christiane's not alone. Here's a clip from the opening of an episode of On the Media, which is a program from public radio station WNYC.
For the last 3 months, Israelis have seen on TV a version of the bombardment of Gaza without the victims.
Their guest who made that argument on the show is an Israeli journalist from a magazine who's reporting everything he wants because he can, because he lives in a democracy. I reached out to WNYC, by the way, to ask whether the show has even once ever addressed the skewed media coverage of the war that people in Gaza and across the Arab and Muslim worlds are getting. And shocker, I, of course, did not hear back. This is an issue that I discussed recently with someone. Anat Sultan Dadon. She's the Israeli consul general to the southeastern United States. You're going to be hearing my interview with her in the future because we talked about grappling with media bias. But for now, here's her response to the kinds of clips that I just played for you.
I think that such a statement can only come from sheer ignorance. I would wish upon any democracy to have the kind of free press that Israel has. We have the full spectrum, even during wartime, we have criticism from both sides. There is a covering of the war. There is criticism of how this war is being run, either not tough enough or too tough, or not doing enough for the hostages, or not doing enough to defeat Hamas, whatever it may be. We have an open and free press, and we have it all. And I think that the healthy, open press, free press that Israel has is something that other countries truly can look to.
But mainstream news organizations ignore this. They were happy to call out Fox News for pushing lies about the 2020 election being stolen. And those lies were specifically designed to degrade people's trust in democracy, to delegitimize democracy, and fuel anti-democratic movements. Meanwhile, these mainstream news organizations have been pushing lies to delegitimize the only democracy in the Middle East. That's what I covered in the first set of episodes on this show, like lies about the term occupation. Tons of nations are currently occupying lands, including Iran. They're occupying lands, and you never hear that. But you do hear that Israel is allegedly controlling, quote-unquote, the occupied territories, even though in reality, Israel left Gaza nearly 20 years ago, and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank says in documents about Jericho that the Israeli occupation period ended 30 years ago. I know, if you're new to this, if you haven't heard episode 1, then what I just said probably went by you really quickly, and you might be like, hey, consider that a teaser. I would love for you to listen to the earlier episodes, and you'll hear all about that. I dig in. Anti-democratic forces in the Middle East and around the world have been pushing lies to delegitimize Israel. That's where these things come from. People screaming that the U.S. election was stolen and people screaming their support for Hamas are both pushing against democracy. And we need the media to take a strong stand against all of it with clarity by covering these anti-democratic movements and providing the facts and context about them. Here's an example. The media should be actively pointing out that Hamas makes a mockery of democracy. In its statement of its alleged principles several years ago, Hamas claimed to stand for democracy. Meanwhile, here is a little clip from something I explained in episode 2. Hamas took part in one election ever, all the way back in 2006. Hamas did not get the majority of votes. It did get a plurality, so more votes than anyone else. And according to a democratic system, there would then be some sort of representative power-sharing government. But instead, Hamas and the other major Palestinian political party called Fatah started kidnapping and killing each other's representatives, each other's activists and leaders, and were these warring factions. And then ultimately, Hamas just took over Gaza and never faced another election for everyone to vote. That's not how democracy works, obviously. The media needs to make clear that the fight for democracy is taking place on multiple fronts and has support on opposing sides. On the right, it's support for fascism. On the left, it's support for Islamist fascism. Coming up, the head of what's called the world's largest alliance. It's not the UN. You'll hear him discuss the central role of media in the fight for democracy. Plus, a woman pleading for media to help democracy take root in her country. And one of the most beloved news broadcasters in American history. Thank you to Mit45 for its support. The company is committed to bringing Kratom to consumers in the right ways. The folks at Mit45 want people to use Kratom safely, legally, and in the ways that are most effective and helpful as part of a healthcare routine in consultation with healthcare providers. Listen to my interview with CEO Ryan Niddell in episode 14. He explained the mission that he's on to try to help people, including in the media, get educated about this. We're back. This is They Stand Corrected. I'm Josh Lebs. What is the world's biggest alliance? According to the Council on Foreign Relations, it's NATO. The Council explains that in international relations, an alliance is a group of countries that come together to promote their common security interests. NATO is all about doing that for democracies across Europe and the United States and Canada. Actually, when I was brought out to Brussels to do a series of speeches, I had some good meetings with people involved in NATO. Earlier this year, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg was interviewed on PBS, and he specifically talked about how crucial the news media are in the fight for democracy.
The truth will prevail, but to ensure that we need a free and independent press, journalists who are doing their job, checking their sources. In democracies, there will be different views, there will be discussions, there will be different opinions, but as long as we have an open debate with a free and independent press, I'm quite certain that democracies will be resilient against any attempt from authoritarian powers like Russia to undermine our democratic institutions.
On this show, I've talked about the Democracy Index, which ranks nations around the world each year. They list Palestinian leadership accurately as authoritarian, ranking it all the way down at 115. The index says Palestine has been one of the worst performers in the Middle East and North Africa recently. It has, quote, an increasingly dysfunctional and undemocratic polity whose deep flaws have been exacerbated by the Israel-Hamas war. Meanwhile, Israel and the United States are listed right alongside each other as flawed democracies. The NATO head you just heard, Stoltenberg, is right that a free and independent press is necessary for safeguarding democracy. But just having that independent free press is not enough. We need it to actually do the job. People who lead news organizations make choices about whether or not they will call out authoritarian powers and all groups that are supporting authoritarian efforts. In preparing for this episode, I came across an analysis that's fascinating. It was by this group of researchers. They looked at the United States and 3 European countries. I'll post a link to it in the newsletter. You can see it. The 3 European countries are Germany, Sweden, and the Netherlands. Anyway, this group of researchers found that in the European countries, watching TV news was associated with support for democracy, but not in the US. Quote, citizens in the United States who use television news to learn about politics and public affairs are more likely to say a strong leader who can ignore elections and parliament is a good way to govern the country. In this case, parliament would be Congress. Not only that, but in the United States, people who watch TV news were more likely to support army rule. The study found that across all the countries, quote, better educated and politically interested citizens are more likely to say a strong leader is a bad way of governing the country. Now, this study was from several years ago, 2017, during Trump's presidency in the United States. But there's no question that it showed that news can be very influential in shaping views of and support for democracy. I mentioned at the top that we live in a time that's different from all of history. These days, people are overwhelmed with content from literally the moment they get up to the moment they go to sleep. All that information and misinformation and disinformation pouring into our phones and our computers and across every platform we use. This breeds dangers. And some people saw this coming long ago. Check this out. In 1979, a guy named David Hoffman did a documentary about information overload and everything it could lead to. 1979. It got a bunch of stuff right. It includes this clip from Henry Kissinger, and you're going to hear him use the word briefer.
With all the information available, there's the danger that you finally become dependent on the briefer, the man who can package it for you in a way that is comprehensible. And the briefer, in turn, may have more the qualities of an actor than of a thinker. And anybody who's ever studied a subject seriously knows that the first thing that comes to your mind is almost always wrong, even though it sounds plausible. And yet, when you are overwhelmed with so much information, you usually act, or you're tempted to act on the first thing that you think you understood.
In the newsletter, you'll find a link to that. There are people who take advantage of the fact that our minds as humans work this way. They package things into messages that seem simple, but are designed to lead societies away from democracy. In many ways, it's about putting blind faith in other people. And all these apps we have now give these manipulators unprecedented opportunities to try to achieve that. In fact, that same study I was just talking about found that only here in the US, when people learned about the news on their phones, they were more likely to support the kind of strong political leader that does not go by elections, etc. We need the media to make clear what all threats to democracy are. This means that just as right-wing media need to acknowledge the authoritarian efforts on the right, mainstream news outlets need to acknowledge the authoritarian Islamist efforts on the left. Just over 10 years ago, there were hopes for democracy taking root in the Arab world. It was something that you might remember called the Arab Spring, with these popular uprisings in several countries. Lots of analyses have looked into why it failed, and a big factor is the media. Here's a quote from Columbia Journalism Review. On the whole, press freedom was even worse than it had been prior to the uprisings. They quote a professor from George Washington University, Mark Lynch, who said this: media organs that had proved crucial to the uprisings degenerated with dismaying rapidity into highly partisan platforms serving state authorities or political factions. I have a clip for you here. This is an activist from Tunisia. There was this event a couple of years ago here in the U.S. with a former president of Tunisia who was talking about the failed Arab Spring. This activist stood up at the event and said the people of the region need media that will support this.
Media for educating for democracy in the Arab world. We need that, and we need to create that. We need to do coalition together to educate people. Otherwise, we cannot do it, because we have to make sure that they understand what the dictatorship in the Arab world are doing to the people. They're killing people.
I know that sound might be a little tricky to understand. She said that the region won't make democracy happen without media educating people about it and about what the dictators are doing. And that brings us back to what I was saying about Israel. I haven't seen any news reports throughout this war, or really in recent history at all, pointing out how amazing it is that the founders of Israel in 1948 even chose democracy. It was not what they had experienced in other countries. And the largest group of people in Israel come from Arab nations, where they were never treated as equal citizens and were subjected to all kinds of separate rules and then pogroms and had to flee for their lives. No one made the founders of Israel choose democracy. They could have chosen a Middle Eastern model and just flipped it, but they didn't. And back in 1948, democracy was not all that widespread. There's a map from the World Economic Forum that I'll put in the newsletter. It shows the world's oldest democracies, and Israel is one of them. That's right, one of the oldest. When it was founded, people in the news understood how precious democracy is. Here is a news clip from 1948.
Amidst the rumblings of battle, the ceremonial ram's horn, the shofar, was heard. And after 2,000 years, Israel was reborn.
This is the famed broadcaster Edward R. Murrow.
You are listening to the hymn Hatikvah, as it was broadcast from Tel Aviv just a few moments after the proclamation of Israel's independence.
וקראתם דרור בארץ לכל יושביה.
In English, proclaim liberty throughout the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Those identical words from the Old Testament appear on the Liberty Bell in Independence Hall, Philadelphia.
All inhabitants. Choosing those words to emphasize this democratic way of thinking, that was a very big deal. And sure, anyone can listen to that report these days and say, well, back then, there were these things that the media weren't thinking about. Okay, but there are things that they were thinking about. The United States and Allied powers had just won a world war in which massive numbers of people died. They fought against fascism. America had successfully protected its democracy and was showing the world that democracy could lead to strength. The need to show that democracy, for all its messiness, is a better way to go, the need for the media to tell that story has not changed. I'll be right back. A big thanks to Nextiva for its support. In business, relationships are everything, and amazing relationships start with a conversation. That's why businesses need Nextiva, the AI-driven platform for seamless, personalized customer interactions across all channels. Businesses can automate up to 90% of their interactions and eliminate 30% or more of their costs. Check it out, nextiva.com. Before we go, I wanted to let you know that I'm working on an episode now about polls. People have a lot to say about polls and what's wrong with them. There's a lot of confusion surrounding them, and they breed a lot of mistrust in the media, which makes sense. So get in touch with me about the polls that concern you, the polls you want to know more about, any questions involving those, and I will be tackling them. Also, for some fun but non-scientific polls, you can jump into the newsletter, where I have some that you can take about the media. Weigh in with your thoughts there. If you're a paid subscriber to the newsletter, then you have access to the comment section and direct access to me. Everyone else, there's a form at my website you can find that will take you through the process of confirming your email. All this stuff is designed to help keep out the haters and spammers and invite in people like you. We are forming a community here at They Stand Corrected, and by listening and caring about this, you become a part of it. I would love to hear from you. Let me know where you're listening from, how you heard about the show, what your thoughts are about it, and I might share your thoughts in an upcoming episode. Also, when you get in touch, we can explain to you how to send a voicemail, and we'll be sharing some of those right here on the show. Thanks so much for listening. I will see you next week. A free way you can help this show. It takes 1 minute, and it makes a huge difference. Go to Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you're at Apple Podcasts, rate and review this show. Write about what you like. Give it 5 stars. And at Spotify, you can rate it also. Give it a high rating there. These things make a difference. I'm hearing from people around the country and around the world that they're discovering the show this way.